Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Anderson. I'm the Director of the Institute for Humanities Research. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Lennard Davis to the IHR today. So Lennard Davis is Professor in the English Department in the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he has also served as head. In addition, he is Professor of Disability and Human Development in the School of Applied Health Sciences at the University of Illinois at Chicago, as well as Professor of Medical Education in the College of Medicine. He's also Director of Project Biocultures, a think tank devoted to issues around the intersection of culture, medicine, disability, biotechnology, and the biosphere. He has written numerous articles in The Nation, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and other print media. Davis has also been a commentator on National Public Radio's All Things Considered and appeared on Morning Edition, This American Life, Odyssey, the Lennard J Show, and other NPR affiliates. His books are too numerous to name, but let me give you a taste. He is one of the founding parents of disability studies in the US and keynotes extensively in Britain, Europe, and the US on disability. His work on disability include Enforcing Normalcy, Disability, Deafness and the Body, which won the 1996 Gustavus Myers Center for the Study of Human Rights Annual Award for the Best Scholarship on the subject of intolerance in North America, and the Disability Studies Reader, of which he's editor, and it's in its 4th edition. His memoir, My Sense of Silence, was chosen Editor's Choice Book for the Chicago Tribune, selected for the National Book Award for 2000, and nominated for the book's Critics Circle Award for 2000. He has appeared on National Public's radio, Fresh Air, to discuss the memoir, which describes his childhood in a deaf family. Davis has also edited his parents' correspondence, Shall I Say a Kiss, the courtship letters of a deaf couple. He is co-founder of the Modern Language Association's Committee on Disability Issues in the Profession, and he is on the board of several academic journals. His most recent work in disability is his book, Enabling Acts, the hidden story of how the Americans with Disabilities Act gave the largest US minority its rights, which was published in 2016 on the 25th anniversary of the Act. Now, if this is not enough, Davis has also written 2 works on the novel, Factual Fictions, The Origins of the English Novel, and Resisting Novels, Fiction and Ideology, and is co-editor of Left Politics and the Literary Profession. He is also the author of a novel entitled The Sonnets. But wait, there's even more. A collection of his essays, Bending Over Backwards, Disability, Dismodernism, and Other Difficult Positions, was published by New York University Press. He was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2002-2003 for his book Obsession, A History. And his book Go Ask Your Father, One Man's Obsession with Finding His Origins Through DNA Testing, was published by Random House. The End of Normal, Identity in a Biocultural Era was published in 2013. The talk he will be giving today, entitled Biocultural Myths About the Poor, will form part of a new book that will be published shortly, but I'll leave that to Professor Davis to talk to you about. Welcome, Lenny, to the IHR.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. The intimate group, so I'll try to keep it somewhat informal. So the talk today is going, I'm just going to wear a mask, I'm sorry. Hope I'm not too muffled. The talk today is from this book that I'm working on, or sort of have finished. It's called Poornography. Kind of a cheesy title in a way, but and the subtitle is something like How People with Money Write About People Without It. And it's a genre, So this talk is from a chapter in which I'm trying to summarize the sort of general cliches, if you want, or stereotypes that are in these books written by people, by and large, by people who are not poor about the poor. So I'm just going to begin reading a little bit, and then I'll go back and forth about that. So I'm using a term that I sort of coined, I think, called ideologemes. And an ideologeme would be like, it's related to Roland Barthes' idea of mythemes. So like little units that float through the culture of ideology that are sort of concretized in to provide a kind of almost like a limited palette for the way you can talk about something. So you'll see what I mean when I describe it. In the paucity of descriptive ideologies about the poor available to writers and visual artists, there are a familiar litany of descriptions: short, stupid, drunk, diseased, dark-skinned, dirty, sexual, criminal, lazy, violent, childlike, mentally troubled are among the top stereotypes. These are the stock and trade adjectives of poornographers. Take, for example, the opening declaration of George Foster's 1850 New York by Gaslight. What a task we have undertaken to penetrate beneath the veil of night and lay bare the fearful mysteries of darkness in the metropolis, the festivities of prostitution, the orgies of pauperism, the haunts of theft and murder, the scenes of drunkenness and beastly debauch, and all the same realities that go to make up the lower stratum, the underground story of life in New York. It's almost like a movie, teaser. This clarion call makes the tacit assumption that readers of pornography, that is the non-poor, are by contrast all tall, smart, white, adult, sober, clean, normally sexual, sane, peaceful, and good. And the further assumption is that these qualities ascribed to the poor are inherently bad, if not flatly repulsive and disgusting. So I'm not the first person to notice the list, and someone like Barbara Ehrenreich, who just died, has written extensively on the poor, pointed out that sociologists like Oscar Lewis and Michael Harrington, who developed the notion that there was a culture of poverty, that the poor person lived in an enclosed world utterly unlike that of the poor. Ehrenreich says that such thinkers conceived of the poor person as, quote, half child, half psychopath. This retrograde position was most illustratively put on the editorial pages of the New Republic in 1964. This is the editorial pages that said that the poor are, quote, a sealed off community with its own crippled values, liable to erupt into crime and psychopathic violence. This is, not that long ago, right? The use of ableist language, i.e. crippled values, combines with an unfounded prediction of criminality and mental illness. It's important to point out that these descriptors are part of a worldview that blames the poor for their conditions rather than capitalism or neoliberalism. Having these traits may be the result of environment, but, and this is how the thought goes, that resilience and inner fortitude, as the conventional wisdom goes, should be enough to withstand these social forces and drive the poor into the ground. So, as opposed to this kind of science around the culture of poverty, we might want to take a look at what I'm calling the biocultural aspect. And I'm using the term biocultural as developed by David Morris and myself in something that's online. You can find it called the Biocultures Manifesto. In that work, we emphasize that in order to understand the contemporary world and its cultural productions, we need to have a foundation not only in the humanities, and we have the Center of the Humanities, but also in the areas of science, technology, engineering, and medicine, STEM, which increasingly are used to describe and regulate our world. If we look at our own times, we can see that something as random as temperature which seems evenly distributed across the globe and not subject to social class, is in fact determined by class. And this would be a biocultural thing to me. Poorer citizens' neighborhoods are more exposed to higher temperatures than our middle class or wealthy ones. Race and poverty combine destructively in this scenario, since formerly red-lined neighborhoods now have higher temperatures and therefore greater exposure to smog, which in turn has demonstrable health consequences. In addition, poorer neighborhoods have smaller parks, and this is the redlining, have smaller parks and less access for inhabitants than in middle class or richer neighborhoods. There are also health side effects as well, since access to nature yields lower stress levels and mortality rates. Racial implications further apply since poor people in New York City, for example, have 21% less park space than their richer counterparts, but people of color have even scantier 33% less. And as we all know, richer neighborhoods have more trees. Not only heat, but air quality impacts poor communities, which leads to more respiratory problems and increased mortality. We cannot and we should not assume that the bad behavior of poor are the major contributors to their living conditions, working conditions, health, and safety issues, and matters of personality or temperament. I'm going to skip a few of these things and move on to my first subject, which is race. This is just I had to do a lot of like Xing out. So this part, which I'm not going to give you, is about how, I'm just going to give you a suggestion of it, how in England in the 19th century, there's a book called Vagabondia, which is, you can see and it's a rather fascinating book that has, illustrations of different kinds of poor people. And it's one of the only books that shows a Black beggar in London, who was this guy, Joseph Johnson, but also, beggars as disabled people. The two groups that have been kind of excised or eliminated from the story of poverty in a weird way, and this would be the case in England, are Jews and Asians and Blacks, who, all you have to do is watch any film about Jack the Ripper, Masterpiece Theater, any of those things, and you always see the East End of London, which is always depicted in this very pornographic way, right? There's always the smoldering fire, the prostitute, the guy beat. The East End of London at that period was 50% Jewish. You never see a Jew except for Fagin, So the erasure of Blacks and Jews, and also Asians, because they were obviously sepoys, they were called, in that neighborhood as well, is part of this sort of, biocultural shift. This is the 5 Points in New York, which was also another neighborhood that was, but in this one, you can see in this picture is a rare a depiction of a Black man on the left and a Black woman on the right in 5 Points. But the point I want to make is that that poor people themselves in the 19th century were seen as a separate race. Jack London, who wrote this book called People of the Abyss, describes the working class people, poor people in East End of London. A new race has sprung up. A street people, a short and stunted people is created, a breed strikingly differentiated from their master's breed, a pavement folk, as it were, lacking stamina and strength, a deteriorated stock left to undergo still further deterioration. And London himself advocated that poor people should not be allowed to marry each other because they literally saw poor people as a separate race. And the whole idea of degeneracy in that period was echoed by someone who you might not expect, Karl Marx and Engels, both thought of poor people as a crippled race. That's the term that Marx used because of exploitation. So, there's a very malleable sense of race, and particularly that races could deteriorate. And along with London saying that they shouldn't marry, Alexander Graham Bell wrote this memoir upon the formation of a deaf variety of human race, saying that deaf people should not be allowed to marry each other because they would create a new race. The person that you might be familiar with is H.G. Wells in his story of the Time Machine, which has the rich and the poor evolve into two separate races in the future. The proletarians become the beast-like Morlocks, and the upper class the enervated Eloi. The time traveler, now in the future, wonders, what if in this interval the race had lost its manliness and had developed into something inhuman, unsympathetic, and overwhelmingly powerful? That Wells links the underground Morlocks to the poor and above ground Eloi to the rich is made clear when the time traveler notes with great certainty, it seemed clear as daylight to me that the gradual widening of the social difference between the capitalist and the laborer was key to the whole position. And he traces this new race of Morlocks to a tendency for laborers, the Morlocks are the ones who live underground, because they take the tube, they're traveling on the Metropolitan Railway under the ground. And so he says, Wells says, even now, does not an East End worker live in such artificial conditions as practically to be cut off from the natural surface of the earth? So in the end, above ground, you have the haves pursuing pleasure and comfort and beauty, and below ground, the have-nots, the workers getting continually adapted to the conditions of their labor. It's interesting, just parenthetically, that for Wells, both the Morlocks in the novel and the Eloi are white. But you can see that in various depictions over, especially in these kind of more lurid ones, this artist has turned the Morlocks into dark-skinned people, and so in the movie also, that particular movie, you can see that. But they're both white. The difference is that the Morlocks are dull white with flaxen hair, and you got a little bit of the flaxen hair there. Their bodies are pallid, and the half bleached color of the worms and things one sees preserved in spirits in a zoological museum. But the reason for the pallor of the Morlocks is because, and I have a whole section here, but I'm not going to go into it. That certain kinds of malnutrition and work conditions were seen as creating a kind of pallor, anemia, neurasthenia among workers, and also that their hair would be blonde, not Nordic blonde, but from nutritional deprivation. Poor people were racialized in other ways. For example, linking poor whites with African and African Americans was a way of saying that all poor people shared similar racialized characteristics. For example, the Irish were seen as a race that was degenerate, ranking lower than the prejudiced status given to African Americans. John Beddoe, in his 1862 article Index of Negrescence, created a ladder of degeneracy by measuring the relative blackness of white Europeans, which placed the Irish on the lowest rung. Jews were also racialized in this way, as Arthur Abernathy's book, The Jew, a Negro, suggests. Abernathy wrote in 1919, thousands of years of effort to throw off their negrescence have failed to eradicate those race characteristics, and the Jew of today is essentially Negro in habits, physical peculiarities, and tendencies. So you can see that race gets poverty gets racialized, and I'm going to stop that section and go to the next one about short. So you heard that Jack London said that that poor people were short, and the vision, especially in the 19th century, of poor people was very different from, say, like the Stanley Kowalski vision of this sort of like dangerous, hulking, working class guy. They are seen repeatedly in the 19th century as small, short, stunted, and weak. In the 18th century, writers complained of a, quote, pygmy generation, a parcel of poor diminutive creatures born to gin-soaked parents. But with the 19th century and the rise of eugenics, shortness was linked to being of weak stock and seen as a result of degeneration. Charles Davenport, who directed the Center on Eugenics in the United States, worried about immigration, and that the influx of Southern Europeans would make the country, quote, darker in pigmentation, shorter in stature, more given to crimes of larceny, assault, murder, rape, and sexual immorality. Immigrants on Ellis Island were turned back for being short. Indeed, the author William Faulkner was rejected by the United States Army for being short at 5'5" and underweight. Dr. Van Every advised against educating African Americans, since such activities would result in dwarfed or destroyed bodies. And as you know, Jack London described the race as being short. The emphasis on shortness as a negative was of course simply observational and probably had to do with the fact that different ethnic and nationality groups have different average heights. In general, Northern Europeans are taller than people from Southern Europe. Jews, who made up the plurality of people in London's East End, were shorter than their British counterparts. Yeah, that was just a little bit of noise coming from the street. Stop that. Seeing this height difference as a type of stunting rather than genetic diversity, eugenicists could argue that shortness combined with other undesirable traits like darker skin color were characteristic of inferior races. The thing is that I you know, as a person who's somewhat short, I've taken this subject to heart, and but this isn't my most scientific moment, but I did a little use of engram, which, you know, you have to do with caution, and I typed the word in tall men, and you can see that post 1800 there's an uptick in emphasis on tall men. Shakespeare uses tall infrequently. More often than not, he uses it when talking about women, like Hermia and Rosalind, who we may remember were played by boys. It's a long shot speculation that tallness and maleness were not necessarily connected as a desired combination until the eugenic period. Authors did not specify the heights of protagonists, like Achilles, Orestes, Hamlet. How tall was Tom Jones? How tall is Darcy? You know, we're never told. Why would we assume that they were tall? These authors arguably did not believe that height was a descriptor of fitness or male dominance or power. If height were important before eugenics, why wouldn't we know the heights of authors and statesmen? The fact that John Keats was 5 feet tall doesn't seem to have entered our consciousness, especially if you watch the movie, a recent movie about John Keats. Likewise, William Blake, 5'1", Sir Isaac Newton, 5'6", James Madison, 5'4", Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, 5'4", Ludwig van Beethoven, 5'4", Franz Schubert, 5'1". We seem barely aware that Thomas Hardy was 5'1". In other words, emphasizing shortness as degeneracy might seem uniquely linked to eugenics. And I think that that's important because it actually has become a very powerful signifier. I have a lot more on it. I'm just going to skip it because otherwise you're going to think I'm obsessed with the subject. And let's go to drunkenness. Another trope associated with poverty is drunkenness. Many novels and news stories, films and books about the poor emphasize and portray the element of alcoholism and drug use. But do the poor drink more or use drugs more than other classes? It seems fairly clear that the rich drink as much, if not more, than the poor, if only because they have the means to procure alcohol. In fact, there is an algorithmic association between the amount of money one earns and the amount of alcohol consumed, with obviously higher income earners reporting drinking more than low income earners. In addition, richer neighborhoods, those with inhabitants that benefit the most from income inequality, consume the most alcohol and marijuana, exactly the opposite of what is usually depicted in literature and film. The question then arises, why are the poor routinely and notionally associated with drunkenness? Could there be some historical reason that middle-class writers looked at the poor and saw drunks? Let's begin with the assumption that over time there were various panics about alcohol that created a class of violators, often the poor, who were seen as abusers of alcohol. Yeah, so, okay. You know, and I'm not going to go into it, the fact that everybody drank a lot of alcohol in the past because water wasn't potable. And, you know, if there was alcohol in it, it killed bacteria. So, but James Nicole, a writer, has convincingly argued that in England, an aspect of class warfare often centered on the alehouse, which was the communal gathering place for working class and poor people. Brewing was, before mass production, a poor person's activity. By the way, my grandmother's name is Weintraub, which in German means, you know, grapevine. And, you know, a lot of Jewish families made wine because they needed it for their religious services. And wasn't easily available in German and Polish countries. So alehouses served as a place where the poor and underemployed could gather, find work, and buy cheap and pleasurable commodity. The first licensing act of 1552 reaffirmed the power of local elites by locking them into a national system of control over an institution which formed the hub of lower class social activity. These types of laws continued right. So basically the ruling class took over by licensing the kind of thing that, by the way, I make wine and I can tell you it's not a big deal. If you bake bread, you can make wine. All you need is grapes and yeast. So it was and beer is very similar. All you need is grain and yeast. So anybody can make it, and it wasn't sold by big companies. You just went down the street to whoever made it. But the fact that the ruling class kind of took over the licensing was a way to control it. Indeed, class was defined by what you drank. In England, poor people drank ale, rich people drank wine. Wine grapes do not grow in England, and so vinous substances had to be imported from France and elsewhere in Europe. And by the way, whenever you see port and Madeira, it's a lot of English novels and in the 19th century and 20th century talk about it, deeply involved in the slave trade. Beer and ale were easily made locally, and wine wasn't, so that there became a political distinction between working classes and the rich, and what you drank counted. And you saw the pictures of Hogarth's Gin Alley, which is the one on the right, and Beer Lane on the left. So gin is seen as the destruction of the working class, and beer is like the solid maintenance of English life. I'm going to skip over some more of those interesting facts about that and move to gambling. I'm not going to read this. I'm just going to say this part. Gambling has also been associated with poor people, and I have a picture of dice playing and among African Americans. The numbers, the lot, all of that stuff is associated with poor people. But actually, and particularly in England, the real gambling was done by the rich. It was based around horse racing, and all the gentlemen's clubs were involved in a lot of scandals about debt. So gambling, like everything else I'm saying, was not necessarily confined to the poor, but what I'm trying to say is that you can see this is there's an element of projection, right? In other words, in this biocultural idea of creating a kind of inoculating society with a kind of set of limited ideologies, you're creating a kind of rationale for the establishment of capitalism, right? Capitalism, as we saw in the 19th century, was not a pretty thing, right? It involved exploitation, it involved, really a kind of wage slavery and a kind of slow violence or fast violence to workers. So how do you justify it? Part of the way you justify it is you have this kind of biocultural development that seeds the population, both rich and poor, with ideas about what's possible and why it wouldn't be a good thing for poor people to do anything other than work in these very difficult conditions presented. And if you don't work, or if you resist working, then you are, I'll talk about that, lazy. Okay, so the other aspect of this is the poor are filthy. And how much time do I have left? You have about 20 minutes. Okay, good. So the poor are filthy. I have an explanation, a biocultural explanation for this, but let me give you a little bit of detail. By 1841, London had become the most populous city on earth, surpassing Beijing. This crowding resulted in a pileup of poor humans within certain neighborhoods of the city. There's no doubt that those areas in which poor people lived in crowded conditions had a great deal of refuse, garbage, food scraps, dead animals, and the like. But filth was not unique to the poor. Rich people still had to dispose of their excretions and ordure. Grander houses, and you see these, kind of 19th century houses. Remember this. When grander houses had multiple cesspools. When filled, these were arched over and another began. And this is a quote from the time. Some of the best homes in the West End were literally honeycombed in their foundations with chambers full of ancient ordure. Even or especially royalty could be filthy. In London, there was a street called Dunghill Mews. Now it's part of Trafalgar Square, so tread lightly when you go there, was located next to the Royal Mews. Obviously, the proliferation of royal horses created the inevitable correlate next door. Versailles, when you go visit Versailles, think of this, was infamous for the stench that hung over it and the frequent leakage of excrement from commodes, as well as untrained dogs and guests urinating and defecating in the stairwells. When the court of Charles II spent a summer in 1665 in Oxford, the local diarist Anthony Wood observed that they were nasty and beastly, leaving at their departure their excrement in every corner. This is the court of Charles II, right? In chimneys, studies, coal houses, and cellars. It would just be interesting to see that shown on TV and in the, Downton Abbey, rather than that same scene over and over again of how the poor are depicted in the East End. So the question is, was the stench of humanity and animal life so unusual that it required writing about it endlessly? I've read a lot of this stuff, including if you read Engel's book on Manchester. It's just like an endless description over and over again, the same thing. So without public toilets, this is just, I'm probably doing too deep a dive on this. But I just want to show you this picture. Without public toilets until the mid 1880s, Londoners of all classes, particularly men, had to urinate in the street unless they found some dedicated indoor location. And by the way, women, there were no places for women to urinate. One of my graduate students was planning on writing a book about this. It's absolutely fascinating. I don't think anyone's ever really written in detail. If you were a woman in the 19th century and you went out, you had to hold it. You could only be out as long as you could hold it. There were no places for you to go. So that's a kind of interesting sort of biocultural fact. So this device here was set up to prevent men from peeing on the walls, because if you tried to, you'd pee on your shoes. And this is actually in London still. It's a little remnant of it, but the point I'm trying to make is that there was a general level of acceptance of filth, if you want to call it that. People had lived in it for millennia, and suddenly there was this new class who thought they could separate themselves from everybody else and avoid odors, excrement and so on. And that class was a very elite class, but they controlled the means of production of description. They had, narrative superiority. And so they created this image that the poor were naturally filthy. Okay, so I have a lot on this, but I'm going to skip through this because not the finest thing to talk about before lunch. It's part of the animus against the poor for filth was based on conception during the Victorian period, and some of you may know about this, about miasma, M-I-A-S-M-A. The idea was that disease, there was a big argument in the 19th century between the germ theory people and the miasma theory people. And miasma theory was actually very popular. Florence Nightingale was a miasma theory person. And the idea was that if you could, literally the smell itself was the disease. Edwin Chadwick, famous for his efforts to create public sanitation in London, had the most succinct and memorable adage: all smell is disease. So the whole idea was to create an odorless world. Otherwise, you would die. And there's lots of examples of people, living through that. So one class of people is living the way humans lived for millennia, and one class is trying to totally change that. And the implication of filth comes really from that clash between worldviews. And just to sort of show you that it isn't true necessarily that poor people were naturally filthy, here's an 1845 letter to the London Times sent by a group of poor residents in London's St. Giles slum known as the Rookery. The Rookery is kind of like this famous case in point of a slum in London that everybody always refers to in this area. So the residents, they wrote a letter about expressing their disturbance about the fact that they didn't have access to privies, garbage cans, drains, or other forms of sanitation. They also complained about the fact that these people who they thought were commissioners from the sewer company who were coming to help them actually turned out to be developers, complaining about the stench that would be affecting their investment in the nearby posher New Oxford Street. Another sign that the poor were not naturally filthy is just a little thing. There was a guy named Charles Cochrane who in the 1840s built public privies and wash stations. He fitted them with wash basins. He calculated that in 1 year, there were 135,916 visits from men, 27,000 from women, 2,000 from children, which amounts to 450 people a day. Cochrane publicized not only the usage, but the fact that no items had been stolen. So his point is that it isn't true that the poor loved dirt. As I'm saying, there's a kind of what I'm calling representational inequality. Some people get to represent themselves and some people don't. And that's not accidental. It's based on structural reasons. I just want to cover one more subject, which is animals. I'm going to skip disease. Here's urinals in New York City, privies, and here's a woman dumping slops on the street. Here's some public baths in London. And now we move on to animals, because I know some people are interested in animals. Okay, one of the myths we confront when we see accounts of poor urban neighborhoods is a repulsion that humans are living intimately with animals, noticeably pigs, cows, chickens, and the like. However, in 18th century London, animals were so common that Alexander Pope could write in his 1708 poem, The Alley, "A brandy and tobacco shop is near, and hens and dogs and hogs are feeding by." Just casually mentions that. It's not remarkable. The reality is that in the 18th and early 19th century, London, pigs were regularly kept in courtyards and enclosed areas within the city. While beef and lamb were driven in from the countryside, pork was a city-bred product. In 1822, 20,000 pigs were sold in the Smithfield market, but the city was consuming over 210,000 hogs and 60,000 suckling pigs, and the majority of these were raised by poor people in the city. I don't know if you know about raising pigs, but if you have any background in rural life, I mean, and my friends do this actually. I have a house in upstate New York. You get a piglet in the spring. It eats all your garbage. It eats everything. They're one of the great recyclers. They're very efficient at extracting protein. And sometime in November, December, you harvest the pig and you have food for the rest of the year. They're very, very efficient, and actually they're not dirty creatures at all, but they have this big stereotyped as that. So in New York City, there's accounts of people coming to New York City, and New York City had pigs running through the streets in the early 19th century. And when the city tried to do something about it, the hog owners complained that they pay their rents and supply their families with animal food during the winter to avoid becoming a public burden. So having pigs around was actually kind of important. I mean, now there's a kind of hipster thing with chickens, but people had chickens, people had pigs. It was not unusual, and it was very efficient, and it was a good way to recycle. But there was the inevitable comparison between, pigs and people. So it was a combination of this prejudice against smells and miasma theory, and the fact that the middle classes were severing themselves from the connection to the production of animals. Here's some pictures: a dead horse in New York City of people living. And this is another one from Hogarth, but you can see the presence of pigs and sheep in the city. So, and of course, the Irish were ones who had a lot of pigs, and they were therefore called pigs. So there was a kind of elision between the animal that you raised and who you were. Okay, and then I'm just going to zip through these. So, the poor were seen as spreading disease. This is an image of cholera, personified as this sort of skeleton under a kind of ghostly cover, stepping on people as it tramples through the city. Cholera was a big disease in the 19th century. And people blame the poor, but I mean, you can just see now, I mean, you don't have to look at the past. You can see now that any disease that comes along, someone gets blamed for. It was the Chinese, it was, for coronavirus, it was, Haitians and gay men for AIDS. I mean, so, and we know that all that kind of like blaming of particular groups is wrong. I mean, that's not what disease is about. But the poor were seen as a residue, a residual pool for a disease. Crime, I'm not going to have time to tell you about this, but crime is, associated with poor people. If you look at especially you look at the numbers, depending on what, if you look at, thievery, there's a whole complex explanation, which I can't go into now, about why the numbers seem greater for poor people, but in fact, it's not necessarily true. And in terms of murder, which is the one that doesn't seem class-based, actually, it looked like more rich people in London were killing each other than poor people were. And just the general idea of a panic about murder and crime rises and falls sort of irrespective of the statistics. And the finger gets pointed at a particular group. So you have to really think about that. The other thing is, in terms of violence and political action, the poor were seen as a repository of this kind of seething violence that, so in other words, instead of saying like the conditions under which people became poor were ones that need to be remediated and changed, the problem became like projecting this anger that poor people must have, in terms of their relationship to the rich, who knew that they were exploiting poor people, and didn't want to place the onus on themselves. So here's a painting by Robert Kohler called "The Socialist," and you can see from 1885, and you can see, the raised fist, the clenched hand, the anger of the socialist. He's not a reasonable academic. He's a firebrand. And the same painter, Robert Kohler, in this wonderful picture called "The Strike," which was reproduced in Harper's Weekly, so it was like reflected the ideology of the moment, shows the on the left you can see the rich man who's the owner of the factory in this kind of barren Dante-esque landscape. On the left of him is a poor woman with two children who've come obviously to seek alms or money from him. But then there's an angry group of workers, and the one worker is confronting him and pointing. There's another one in the back who's raised his fist. The cameo that's kind of important there is the woman arguing with, is it her husband or her friend? He's going like this, it's like, what can we do? And she's like the Victorian kind of angel in the house who's saying like, well, slow down, buddy. But the important image is this one of the man on the lower right who's picking up the stone. He is going to be the one who's he's the like locus of the violence. The violence is brewing, but he's picking up the stone. He's going to change the whole story. So, locating violence in the working class, and this other picture by William Balfour Kerr called "From the Depths," of these rich people, living the good life, and below them, supporting their floor, are these workers' bodies. And you can see cracking through the floor is the raised fist. And this is kind of like, I think, Jacob said this, it kind of sums it up nicely about the fantasy of the anger of the poor, when the reality is that the violence that did happen historically was the violence of the factory owners combined with the military and the police. And I just have a series of pictures. This is the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester, which you may know about, in which the army came in and slaughtered peaceful protesters. There's the Latimer and Columbine strikes and also the Chicago Railroad strike, the Pullman strike, all of these ones where these huge numbers of police and soldiers were called in to completely shoot, kill, murder workers. And I have another thing about laziness, but I think I'm out of time, so I'm gonna skip it. But just to let you know that laziness was attributed to workers, but white workers, particularly in the South, were seen as having hookworm. Hookworm was a disease of the poor because from walking barefoot, you would get these worms that would enter your body and that would supposedly make you lazy because they would weaken you and enervate you. Turns out, actually, it's a biocultural myth because there's there's a whole lot of new information about bacteria, parasites that actually seem to be protective in a certain kind of way. I'm sure you've seen things where people are like dipping their arms into larvae now because to get rid of infections and stuff. So this whole thing with the hookworm was made up. And Black people seen as lazy is a part of the stereotypes in the United States. And instead of talking about laziness, what you might want to talk about is why people don't, the ideology that everybody has to work at whatever job is presented. That's how you tell about the success of the country. If you refuse it, then you are lazy. And that's my talk today. Sure. We can get rid of Niall DeMarco there.
I'll take the microphone. Okay, does anyone have any questions? And I think there's a whole bunch of people online. Welcome, hello. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and Jacob will ask them for you.
This is not a question, it's just a thank you. Yeah. It's a wonderful presentation, and I kept jumping to today, like how much parallel there is over the centuries. And, the exposés, they're journalistic, of the lack of plumbing, disposal waste in Mississippi, people having, slosh in their yards. It's just like deeply ingrained, these concepts that you pointed out. I don't really have a question, but I just wondered if you draw any parallel.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, I think a lot of these stereotypes have been, the word I was thinking about this morning, this is like an inoculation into the culture, and they're persistent. They have stayed. If you think about it, even if you just think about like talk to anyone on the street about why are people poor, you'll get this kind of genre of explanations, because in some ways we don't have good explanations, or the explanations don't come from the people who are poor themselves, or they're disregarded. So one of the things in my book that I try to make a distinction between is what I call exo writers and endo writers. So exo writers are, the majority of novels that we read about the poor are written by people who were never poor. So like, just think about it, like, Grapes of Wrath. It is sold more copies than almost any other book about poverty. Steinbeck, it was a reporter. I mean, he never traveled that path. He got information from other people. It's a specific kind, and it's a kind of wonderful book in many ways, and but it fits into the genre of pornography. Dickens is the when I've been working on this, people say like, what do you oh, Dickens, Steinbeck. Dickens, had this kind of like little biographical blip in his life where his father was. So anyway, I'm talking about exo writers, who are the ones who are the majority of books that we know about the poor are written by them. Endo writers is what people who come from poverty and who write about it. Those are the books we know less about. Like I was just saying, today I'm teaching a book by Mike Gold, who some of you may know, called Jews Without Money. It's a book, it's kind of a recherche thing at this point, but it's written by someone who was poor. So it's not a surprise that the books that are dominant are the ones written by exo writers for readers who have been inoculated and want to see the world that they are being presented. They don't want to see the world that endo writers write because it's unfamiliar to them. It doesn't seem real. It doesn't seem right. It's sort of like, I mean, my analogy is always the Western. Like when we all know when we see a Western, we know exactly, it's like Westworld. We know exactly what there should be. There should be the swinging doors on the saloon. And I did a little research, by the way, very few Western bars had those doors and didn't look at all like they were more like stores that go in deeply and they're not wide. That was built for the theater, for movies. But the point is, we know there should be the prostitute, the sheriff, the bad guy with the black hat, so that's a genre. This is a genre. And you would think that like people would want to get the truth, but in fact, they want the fantasy. And that's what seems real to them. So I may have gone off a little from what you asked, but yeah.
Why do they want the fantasy?
Because it seems right. Feels familiar. That's what they expect. I mean, I always say, I grew up in a poor family. I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. With my father was employed about half the year. My parents were both deaf. I mean, we lived in a 1-bedroom with 4 people. The whole square footage of the apartment was probably like the size of this room. And, if I write that story about what that was like, it's not going to interest you because my father wasn't a drug addict. He wasn't violent. I mean, I had a perfectly nice life as a poor person, but that's not what people want. That's not what the gatekeepers and the editors and the publishers and the filmmakers, that's not what they want. They want, they want to see the cliches of the thing that's familiar to them.
Have we got Ron?
Thanks, Nicole, and thank you for a really lovely presentation. So I'm interested in what the role of technology, there are a lot of technological changes in the 19th century, and how technology is used as a way of, as a class distinction. As the more refined you are, you can have wine rather than beer. You can you can relieve yourself wherever you like, as opposed to, having to use the streets or something like this. Access to food is different. So how did you see perhaps technology as a way of creating class distinctions or differentiations? And how are the shifts in technology in the 19th century also indicative of that?
Yeah. That's a good question, and I don't know that I have an incredibly structured answer to that. But I mean, some of the things that pop into my head are, look, I mean, the big technology is industrial, right? I mean, that's the dramatic thing, and that technology, although it was artisanal in a certain kind of way, like the mechanics were not people who were being trained at technical schools and so on. It was artisanal. So the working class is actually deeply involved in the technology, building it, running it, all of that. So, but then not benefiting from it. So there's a kind of huge kind of asymmetry between the making of the technology, the owning of it. And I think that's part of the tension when you read something like Das Kapital, right? That it's literally like that, the work is being done, but totally alienated the result. The other thing I would say is, just to go back to this thing that we were discussing about toilets and animals and all of that, is, there's an interesting lag between the capability of the technology and the fantasy of the technology. So, for example, the first complete sewer system that was for the entire city was actually in Brooklyn in about 1904. So that means before that, any city did not have a unified sewer system, but there was an aspiration. This is the whole Chadwick thing about having a city that didn't smell, that had efficiently got rid of all of its excrement. And the point about that is, because there's a kind of lag, the people who are sort of victimized by the lag are, everyone's living in it, but the people who are kind of pointed to and victimized are the ones that have the least power. So the technology in a way like highlights the economic gap, yeah.
Real quickly, I'm reminded of Greenblatt and Gallagher wrote a collection of essays on new materialism and new history, and there's a wonderful one by Gallagher on potatoes, and the basic argument being that many of the bread riots and scarcity of bread and the attempt to push the poor and the Irish onto potatoes was this it was a class distinction, of course. The poor can live off potatoes, but potatoes didn't take a technology to create and to harvest, right? You could stick it in the ground and you can, clean them off, boil them, and eat them. Whereas there was a technology for bread, and that technology bound people to a community in a sense of belonging. And so to push people onto the potato was to excise them from community. So I found those kinds of instances rather interesting. Yeah. And then the same with, the pig as dirty, etc. Versus there was an advocacy for people having cows because that fit with the bucolic, right? And they could have their own milk and produce cheese and sell some cheese, etc. So I found those distinctions incredibly interesting.
Good. Yeah.
But thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions?
So we have a question from the online audience, which is let me try to paraphrase this well. What are some of the tactics of resistance that those subjects being represented among these images take up? And I'm thinking of the strike painting in particular, to resist this sort of apparatus of pornography that you're engaging.
Yeah. I think I can say like two things maybe that are not necessarily supportive of each other. One is that, obviously trade unionism and Chartism and communism and socialism were logical strategies that united people, but the power of the state was rather dramatic. And I read a bunch of novels, and particularly in the 19th century, early 20th century, about strikes, and almost all the novels are not written by working class people and always end with a failed strike. There's a history of working class resistance, but also there, one thing I didn't mention, and I have a whole chapter in the book, is about prostitution or sex work. Some people like Lyndon Nead have seen women making the choice to be sex workers in the 19th century as a form of resistance to capitalism. It's a really complicated subject. I don't just want to float it here, but I will say that the choice for a woman in the 19th century who was poor or working class were really super limited, and most of the jobs, either working in factories or being a domestic laborer or being a milliner or a seamstress, paid almost nothing and were very dangerous. The one that I always point out is like everybody, like the upstairs, downstairs, Downton Abbey thing, where the people downstairs are all really happy, a big happy family. That most people, they didn't want their daughters to go into domestic labor because of the nature of that work, which was arduous. You weren't allowed to date, you weren't allowed to get married, you had to work 6.5 days a week, and you could be easily subject to sexual abuse and get pregnant, in which case you'd be fired, and then once you didn't have a letter of recommendation, you could never get a job anywhere. So like the choices weren't great for women, and there's a certain, Judith Walkowitz has written a lot about this, about that the fallen woman story is actually not accurate. The more accurate story is that women tended to, if they were going to be sex workers, tended to do it between 18 and 23, accumulate a little bit of capital, and maybe open up a small business of their own. it, you know, there's a lot to say about it, but that is a form of resistance. Yeah, and then I think later in the 1930s, another form of resistance is that poor people started to be writers. It's harder to find working class writers in the 19th century, but you know, with the advent of the Communist Party, the John Reed Club, you start having people like, you know, Richard Wright and Arnaud Bontemps, and you know, a lot of the Harlem Renaissance writers are people who are like were, you know, part of this movement to be writer workers, in which case they could take over they could equal out the inequality of representation. And that is a kind of resistance as well. I mean, there are more examples, but yeah.
It's tremendously generative. Thank you.
How are we going for time?
We have time for 2 or 3 more questions.
Thank you for your talk. A couple of things came to mind. I'm trained as a mental health therapist, and there's something called the self-serving bias. So that when other people do things that are wrong, we attribute them to character flaws. But when we do something wrong, we say it's situational. You know? So if somebody's acting like a jerk, it's because they're a mean, nasty jerk. If I do, it's because I missed lunch or didn't sleep.
Right.
And so your talk really reminded me of that self-serving bias of just assigning character traits. Also, there was a psychology study that they made people play Monopoly, and let's say they gave you an extra $1,000 on a few properties. And when they interviewed people of why they won, you would attribute it to your skill. And not that everything was set up for you. And also is an interest in the criminality. And like you said, equal number of murders and also white collar crime costs society huge. And when they've done psychological studies on CEOs of companies, they actually rate very highly on the 22 traits of psychopathology.
Well, that's all fascinating. Thank you for that. But I think the general point is, yeah, that you have to find the way, you know, I think I've made this point before, but you have to find the way to justify capitalism, and as opposed to what came before, right? So the way you justify it is to say, you know, I always love the justification, like, you know, I earn my money, you know, that the capitalist says like, I earn my money, or my grandfather earned the money, you know, and so it was justly earned, and it's not exploitation. You know, I'm just simply employing people. It's for the good of the country. When you start, you know, sort of like unpacking that there, how do you explain, you know, people's resistance, if you want to say that, and I think your point is well taken. There's a projection, there's a character assassination that happens as a result of that. Also, you know, I mean, you mentioned mental health, or, you know, what I would call psychic distress. And I mean, that's a big factor that plays into, you know, being poor. I had a whole section on that I didn't talk about, but, you know, and I think that the rise in like, fascination and control, if you want to say, of depression is also tied to, you know, tied to a structural issue. There was an article in the Times, I think last week, where someone was talking about this. You know, we tend to, rather than make it a personal flaw or a chemical imbalance model, to see it as a larger biocultural social issue that's tied up with, you know, many things, including employment and non-employment.
There's a long history. Well, I'm obsessed with strikes and labor history. So, but from a feminist angle, and women have always been resisting those conditions of work. And there were women's strikes separate from men's strike. So there's like a long, rich history of the workers and poor people, you know, fighting back. But the power of capital is just too much. But there are victories.
Yeah,
and you know, there's a way. A student of mine wrote an essay that was in Harper's called "The Digital Poorhouse." I don't know if you saw that, but it's about technology, contemporary technology, and the way it surveils the poor. And they're the most poorly surveilled category of people in the US.
I'm just going to write this down.
Yeah,
digital
poorhouse.
Yeah.
And she did her dissertation on poor women who went to the YMCA to learn skills technology skills so they could get better paying jobs. But the skill training, they assumed these women knew nothing about technology, even though they were surveilled every minute of their life by the state in order to qualify for welfare rights. So they knew a lot. She asked them, they already knew a lot about technology, and this training program was not preparing them for jobs that would pay a living wage. It was just like piecework in the
Yeah.
19th century. It wasn't-
Yeah, I mean, and I did have a section, and this is always the thing when you have a long thing and you cross it out, you can always claim you had a section on something, right? But I did have a section on peaceful but mass protests, and on the Lower East Side, since you know this, you probably know this, there were a number of strikes by Jewish women against the price of meat, and they were there's something like 10,000 women, you know, protesting it and getting results. So yeah. She died? Oh yeah. Didn't know that. I knew her. I know her work. Yeah. Okay. And Barbara Ehrenreich just died, so we're losing a lot of people. Yeah.
Okay, I think we can leave it there. Can we just all thank Professor Lennard Davis for his
you.
wonderful talk? Thank you.